Hi, my name is Darcy, and I am going to talk about sourdough cultures and bread and making bread. But one of the things that I think is a little different about how I come at it is that although I have always been a baker, I have always loved to create food and make cakes. I'm also a scientist, and my degrees are in chemical and biomolecular engineering. And so when I'm working with sourdough, I really look at it in a little bit of a different analytical way. So rather than looking at it as something that I'm creating in the kitchen, I'm actually looking at it as a collection of microbes that are doing different individual things. And by far, I'm not an expert in sourdough, but I've done a lot of reading about it. And so while I don't study sourdough in a lab, I have made a pretty substantial study in my own kitchen, just watching what it does, and a substantial study of the related literature. So this is kind of my generic, but probably too long presentation about what I found about sourdough and why I think it's just so cool. Um, so save that for the end. Sourdough has a really long and very storied history, and this is my shirt for today. It says Sourdough Scientist. Pretty excited about it. Um, So commercial baker's yeast, like the powdered granulated stuff that comes and you add it in, you add some sugar and it starts bubbling, you proof it, and then you throw it in a thing, you let it rise for an hour. That's been about available about 150 years. But before that, the primary way to make any bread that wasn't a flatbread was to make the bread with some sort of microbial organism, and it took some time. So one of the things that they would do kind of very far back, so they see records of that as far back as 4000 BC in Egypt, is that they would make the bread with sours from grape juice or wine or beer or sour flour, something like that. And in general, that was something that they had been fermenting. And then they took those same microbes and threw them into flour and let them kind of leaven the bread a little bit. Um, the earliest known leavened bread dates back to about 37,000 BCE. Around Switzerland, they found evidence for that. And legend says that there was even a sourdough starter aboard the Columbus expedition. And I think that's very apropos because, in general, we have our sourdoughs and we have our starters and we treasure them, we name them, we kind of tend them like a part of our household. So it would not be at all surprising to me that as people migrated around the world, they were very careful to bring that culture with them. So one of the things that's really interesting is that the various sourdough cultures vary a ton by both the region and but the baking traditions. And they are found on every continent and in all parts of the world. Um, so one of the places that you can look if you're interested in more information about that is the Library of Sourdough Cultures at Paratos. This is the link that was there when this was created, though it could have changed. I've seen them kind of reorganize their website a couple of times. And that library has a collection of sourdoughs that were collected from around the world. And what they do is that they keep them in sterile conditions and maintain those sourdoughs. So when they take it out to feed the sourdough, they feed it according to the tradition that it was fed with from grain from that part of the world. And so they're actively maintaining the microbial diversity of sourdoughs from around the world. So there's sourdoughs there from 130, there's 130 sourdoughs at last count when I looked last, and they're from over 23 different countries, and they represent about 250 years of sourdough history. One of the things that I thought was kind of interesting is that there weren't any sourdoughs that were kind of African sourdoughs. So if you go in there, you can kind of click on the map, you can choose the different continents, and there was nothing for Africa. And I wasn't sure, I didn't know, but since I looked at the Puratos website, I actually discovered that there's an Ethiopian flatbread that is essentially a sourdough. It's made with teff and starter, and you kind of mix all that together, and then you just keep adding flour over time, flour and water, and let it ferment. And then you take that dough and pour it almost like a pancake to create what looks like a really big pancake, but it's a bread. It's not particularly sweetened. And if you look at the bread, it has all these air pockets inside of it. So it's a tender, soft bread that's made. So there has to be more, and that's something I'd absolutely love to go and find out more about African sourdoughs because that seemed to be at the time a little bit of a blank spot. But I'm certain because we have such a deep history with microbes, I am almost certain that we would find something there. So the injera that I was talking about that's made with teff and a starter looks a lot like this. It's just kind of they serve a meal on it and it's family style, and then everybody takes additional pieces and they use that to eat the bread. So it's a little bit like eating something with pita bread. That was something I grew up with. And my great grandmother used to make pita, and you would create it and it would poof. This is the same thing. You kind of scoop with it, and it has a bit of a sour taste. So teff is a gluten-free flour, um, and so it can kind of it's kind of a slightly different grain, but it's one that is common in that area. So at any rate, when you're talking about sourdough and your grain selection or your flour selection, if you look throughout the world, one of the most common things that's used is wheat-based flour. And in part, that's because most of the microbes have kind of come to be interested in eating gluten, but you can adapt them to other grains. So what they will do over time is that they will adapt to a preferred food source. So many of them prefer the components in wheat flour, but if you were to take time to kind of train it in a different direction, you could potentially make one. It would depend whether those microbes have the ability to digest those things or not. But if you go to a region where another type of grain is being used, you would be more likely to find a sourdough that has already kind of adapted itself to that over time. So injera uses teff, that has no gluten. But there's a structural difference. It's a flatter and a it's a fluffy, flatter bread. So you can see that because the grains are a little bit different between the gluten and other grains that are around, particular to this case, but also to any case, the texture of the bread may change somewhat as you're changing the grain because that's kind of what's giving the bread structure. So over here, this doodle is a gluten molecule, or a I guess gluten molecule, and it actually has two parts. So there's this kind of stringy bit, and then there's kind of stretchy bits, and that's what gives the bread. So when under normal circumstances you're kneading that bread and you're pulling those gluten molecules into a long line, and that's what gives the bread its structure and its consistency. And then also those can stretch. So if you want to make certain types of bread, like when you're making like one of the things you do when you're making like pizza dough is you look to see if you can get a window, or if it's stretchy, if you can pull it and it kind of snaps back. So if you are interested in adapting a culture, it's something that's going to take time and take patience. I had tried to do that with a rice-based blend, and I did not have a lot of luck, but I did not have very much patience at the time. So I suspect that if I went back and took a little more time to do that process, it would probably work better. The other option is always to go and buy a starter that's been pre-adapted. So there are out there and available. But if you are kind of somewhere in the Americas, you're going to find that you probably, or at least in North America, there's probably somebody in your neighborhood that has a sourdough starter. So go in your local community groups and have a look-see. Um, so one of the things that is most fascinating to me is that um, sourdough is really a human organism symbiosis. So a symbiosis is when two or more organisms work together and they're intertwined and their survival is improved by the presence of the other. So there's a lot of times when we have a lot of microbes that kind of live on us and they don't really matter to us. They do great, but they haven't really improved our life much. There are some things that live in our gut and they help us digest. So without certain E. coli, we wouldn't have vitamin K, we'd have a nutrient deficiency. And then there's some things that are parasites, and that kind of takes away from our health. So, generally parasites are not so good, but a symbiosis relationship benefits both participants. And so I really have a theory that sourdough wants to be shared. It wants to be taken care of. And so we are actively benefiting from having sourdough. We get tasty bread, and it actually gives us bread that is better and more nutritive, that's easier to digest. It's not as hard on our digestive systems, and we take care of it. So even though some portion of the microbes are turning into tasty bread, we're still maintaining the culture, and oftentimes we're then sharing the culture. So my personal theory on this, which is completely unsubstantiated, but my personal theory is that this is a deep symbiotic relationship, and that we've been developing this for a long time. And that as we've developed this symbiotic relationship, sourdough has spread further, all of the organisms in there, and we have benefited from it greatly by getting that nutritional whatnot that's in there. We'll cover that more later. So this is from an article that one of the articles that I was absolutely fascinated with. It says, altogether, it seems that not only can bakers contribute microorganisms to their food, but their daily work contributes microorganisms to them. In other words, the microorganisms on our hands may record not just who we are, but also how we have lived, with bakers' bodies specifically documenting their intimate relationship with bread. So what happens is there's the thing called sourdough hands. And in this case, it demonstrates how very personal a sourdough starter is to the baker. And so the more that you handle it, so for people that are baking all the time, this is very, very true. For somebody who's only occasionally touching it, it may not be as much. But essentially, as you touch the sourdough, as you work with it, as you touch the bread, you shake the bread, you put the sourdough in, make breads. The sourdough is leaving microorganisms on your hands, and anything that you've been in and microorganisms from your body will make their way into the culture, which makes this an even deeper symbiosis and an even deeper connection between the microbes. So what they did in this study is they looked, there's a link to the study in this, but I don't think you'll be able to click it from the video. I'll put my resources, my references are available if anybody wants to get in touch. What happened is they had a bunch of bakers, people who are making sourdough all day, people who are expert sourdough bakers, start their own culture from scratch. So everybody did that during the pandemic, but these guys are like, the kind of the experts in maintaining a starter and growing a starter and getting it going and all of those things. So what they did is they had those bakers create a new sourdough, and then they had the bakers bring the sourdough in, and they tested the genetic profile of the hands of each baker and each sourdough that was each starter that was made. And what they found was that over and over, they could actually look at the microbes that were there and see what the distribution was, and there was more of this and less of that, and some were completely absent and some were really, really heavily present, and they saw this correlation. And so it was strong enough that they could actually, without looking, somebody who could read these charts talking about what types of microbes were there, were able to match, of these 6 bakers and these 6 starters, which one matched. And they could do it because they were that close, and the overlap between the microbes was that substantial. So the longer that you have a sourdough, the more it becomes uniquely your sourdough, because everything that's in there is part of that relationship between you and your starter. So after time, the baker's hands and the sourdough look a lot like each other. And one of the things even that they've noticed is that there's a lot of microbes that are not normally found on people's hands, or microbes that are found in substantially lower amounts. For example, bakers have more likelihood of having things like lactobacillus and more things that are not typical for human hands, but they're there for the bakers, which is really wild to me. And none of them are harmful bacteria. It's nothing bad. Like, you could stick your hands in and you can eat the bacteria. You could smear it on your face, the sourdough starter. None of it's going to hurt you. So it's not a bad thing, but it is an observable change for people who are constantly working with the bread. And that's just wild to me. So in addition to having a symbiosis between the person who is making the sourdough and the sourdough itself, there's also a symbiosis happening within the sourdough. And so generally what happens is there are two different types of microorganisms inside of the sourdough starter. So one of them is yeast, and we're pretty familiar with that. We think, oh, okay, yeast is what we use to leaven bread, and it makes the bready smell. But there's also bacteria in there, and they both have independent jobs and work together to convert the flour or the carbohydrates into a variety of nutrients and flavors and whatever else is in the bread. And then it's the yeast that eat up the carbohydrates from the flour and start kicking out carbon dioxide. And that's where the bubbles come from. So as they're spitting out carbon dioxide into the flour dough, you get all these little pockets of air in there from the microbes. And when you put it in the oven, those pop up, and then you have a nice fluffy bread. Delicious. So here's just a brief overview of types of microbes that you might see in there. So for the yeast, there's really basically what it's doing is it's doing an alcoholic fermentation. And so we're kind of familiar with that, right? Because there's also yeast in beer and wine and all of those things. But the fermentation, basically, they're taking sugars and they're breaking it down into carbon dioxide, some of it, and into ethanol. And it kind of depends which metabolism they're doing on the temperature and on the what kinds of sugars are there and how the microbes are feeling and that sort of thing. And whether they're doing it aerobically or anaerobically. So a lot of them are Saccharomyces, the S. Saccharomyces cerevisiae, CA is one of the most common. And then there's two types of bacteria. Well, there's lactic acid bacteria, but it works in two different ways. So one of the lactic acid bacteria sorts of things is doing more of a homofermentative, so it's kind of self-fermenting. It's breaking sugars down into lactic acid is the one thing. And then there's ones that are doing heterofermentative reactions, and they're breaking the sugars down into lactic acid, acetic acid, and CO2. So if it's doing the one where you're ending up with lactic acid, you've got more of a creamy flavor. So lactic acid is more of like the milky yogurty kinds of tastes. And so it would be a little more what we would describe as being creamy. And the ones that are breaking it down into lactic acid or acetic acid or CO2 are going to be the ones that have more tang. So lactic acid, same. Acetic acid, that's vinegar. So if you have more vinegar, you're going to have a more tangy, tart bread. It's going to feel more sour. So that would be more like the flavor profile of like vinegar or maybe kimchi or something kind of in that direction, maybe kombucha. So all of those more vinegary flavors are going to come from the heterofermentative reactions. So a lot of those will be lactobacillus, though not entirely lactobacillus. And the one that we might be most familiar with is lactobacillus acidophilus, because that one shows up if you look at the back of your yogurt package. That one is probably going to be there. Not every yogurt, but many, many yogurts. And then one that is pretty kind of pay attention here, there's Lactobacillus San Franciscans, and that is the I'm going to botch these a little bit. There was once upon a time that I probably would have said it perfectly way back in grad school, but it's been about 20 years, I think, at this point. So that San Franciscans, that's your San Francisco sourdough. So if you have a starter that has started from San Francisco, or if you've inherited one that started in San Francisco, you may have some of that type of bacteria, but it will also pick up bacteria. So as the sourdough moves from place to place, it picks up bacteria and yeasty beasties that are just in the air or on your hands or in your kitchen. And so the flavor will subtly change from place to place, and bacteria that and yeast that can continue to live will still be there and have a great time, but some of them may not love the new environment as much. So you maintain some of that, but you may have a predominant culture that shifts, and then your sourdough will take on an entirely new flavor. So it's kind of cool to see those things change. I have a friend, actually the one that I got my sourdough from, who had gotten it originally in San Francisco and then moved around the country. And as they moved around the country, the flavor of it sort of shifted. I've only ever had mine in the Austin area, Austin, Texas area. But from what I understand, the bacteria and yeast around here are really phenomenal, and I've had no complaints. And honestly, most of the sourdough that I've had that's been made by other people has been delicious. So, um, if you are talking about these sourdough acids, the ones that are giving the flavor, there's two main ones. There's a bunch of stuff in there, but the lactic and acetic acid both have very similar structures. They're both alpha hydroxy acids, and the structures look like this down on the screen. So um, one of them has 1, 2, 3 carbons, and wait, 1, 2, 3, yeah, 3 carbons. One of them only has 2 carbons, and that's kind of the difference. But you can see that 2 line and O and that 1 line OH, that's the alpha hydroxy bit, and that's the part that kind of gives this molecule its oomph and gives it that kind of acidy kind of notion. And then the slight flavor differences are because of the difference in how long that is. It's one's 1 carbon bigger, and so it tastes a little bit different. It's kind of cool, right? You get two. And so there's actually ways that you can change how long it proofs for, or you can change the temperature it's proofing at to bring the temperature up a little bit or down a little bit. That'll change the ratio of those flavors. So the acetic acid and the lactic acid are preferred a little bit more, a little bit less at various temperatures. So that's one of those things that you can just play around with, right? If you like do a long proof in the refrigerator, try to proof it in your oven, proof it in a cold corner of your kitchen with a towel wrapped around it, proof it on a hot summer day, your sourdough will vary just a little bit. And some people can taste those differences and some people may not. It kind of depends on how focused in you are on those flavors. I have a super taster in my household, and I will tell you what, he is completely aware of any minor changes. And then I've had people that are like, I don't know, it's bread, it tastes good. So there's a range there. So the lactic acid bacteria produce lactic acid and acetic acid. And as I said already, one is the lactic acid is tart and sour and um, milky, and the acetic acid is more vinegary and sour. And the temperature and length of fermentation is the primary thing that affects the ratio of those acids. So when these things are being produced, the production of acids continues to lower the pH. So the pH of a starter should be around 3.5. And that's a couple things. One is it's what gives that sourdough its characteristic flavor. So without that characteristic flavor, you kind of lost the whole point. It's also a method of lactofermentation. So lactofermentation is basically when you have any of those lactic acid bacteria and they're in there and they're generating a high acid level. So sourdough, we end up baking it, but the starter is kind of protecting itself. And we see the same thing. So yogurt is protecting itself. It's more stable than milk. Kombucha is protecting itself. When we lacto-ferment vegetables, we make lacto-fermented pickles, kimchi, any of those things. Those are all kind of shelf stable because of the high acid level that protects it from most of the really bad bacteria. And so some of the stuff that can get in there and can really make you sick just can't live at that high acid pH. So that's why that is such a historical method of protecting food from various things. So with pH, if the number is small, right, like a pH 1 or 2 or 3, that number is big acid. If the number is big, like a 10 or an 11 or a 12 or a 14, that number is basic. So it means it's more like on the other end of the spectrum, like bleach, which can also not be a great environment for bacteria to live in. Bleach kills stuff, but bleach is also not very good for humans, whereas humans are much more likely. Many of the drinks that we consume are somewhere between like 6 and 3 pH. So if you look at acids and lemonade or if you look at soft drinks and lemonade and all of those things, they all have a very acidic pH, and many of the foods that we consume are very acidic. And if you go start looking to see if you can find some basic foods, they are few and far between. I think egg yolks might be one of the basic foods that we eat. There's a few more out there, but we are much more likely to be consuming acidic things. And those acidic things, once the pH gets up above about a 3.5, are safer and protected. So this is kind of a cool thing to think about when you're choosing your foods and when you're eating fermented foods, that historically, before we had refrigerators and sealed stuff and canning, that was historically a way to ensure that the food would be protected. So if you had to store food for a long time, you would be storing it acidified so that it wouldn't have those microbes in it. All right, so there's actually a lot of benefits. So one of the big benefits that's, kind of historically relevant is preventing those pathogenic microbes from invading the sourdough ecosystem, not having them in there, not having them sit there in the bread and start cranking out whatever poisonous, like botulism toxin. That's really bad, but botulism doesn't do well at a high pH. So basically, that's a biggie. But one of the things that is kind of important is that when that becomes acidified and when those microbes are in there, it increases the breakdown of phytic acid. So phytic acid is something that kind of blocks the bioavailability of minerals. So if you have phytate running around in your system, it's going to make it harder for your body to absorb minerals. So it will increase the functional value of the bran and the wheat germ and whatever else is in there that you're trying to get from the bread, so it's more nutritive. And then the other thing is that because it's breaking down all those complex carbohydrates and the breakdown products of the carbohydrates and turning it into all of those acidic components and some other types of things that are not like high carbohydrate, it actually will decrease the glycemic index of the bread and improve its digestibility. So as I talked about before, this really is conferring benefits. It's conferring benefits from the bacteria's action and from the yeast's action in there that will allow you to get more nutrition out of the bread. So that basically ups the whole level of nutritive stuff from the bread. Fantastic, right? So there have been some studies, if you are gluten sensitive or gluten have an allergy or something, do not go eat bread. Talk to your doctor, talk to a professional, do a test somewhere safe, something like that. Have a EpiPen ready. This is not my advice, but there have been studies out there that even suggest that going through the sourdough fermentation process, because it's breaking down the gluten, it may render the flour and bread safe for some people that have gluten sensitivity and even some severe gluten sensitivity, which is absolutely wild to me. However, there's a lot of breads. If you go to the grocery store and buy a sourdough bread, there's a lot that are made sourdough breads by putting in sourdough flavor, but they're basically preparing a bread that's been flavored to taste like sourdough. So it has to be a sourdough that was properly proofed and that it was a really long proof. So if you do a really short proof or you do a quickie or you throw some sourdough in, like you throw some discard in there to give it a sour flavor, and then you use some kind of like a quick, like use quick yeast or you use baking soda to leaven it, it will not have that effect. So if you are going to mess around with that, I didn't tell you to do it. I told you it was dangerous. And also, make sure that you are sourcing your sourdough properly and that you know what you're doing. Do it under the supervision of a physician only. So additionally, sourdough bread tends to stay mold-free longer than a plain old yeast bread, but this is not applicable if it is a bread that has been prepared with preservatives and it has been sitting on the store shelf for about 10 months. Another thing that happens is it can inhibit amylase activity, and that will kind of prevent it from being a too sour sourdough. So sourdough grows in the same way that most microbes do. So just like people, they respond to being fed and treated well and everything else. So what happens, they respond to these changes, and what happens is that when you start off, right, you're putting some starter in some flour. And that flour is food for the microbes, right? They love it. So you have this curve. This is like a typical microbial growth curve. And what happens is that there's a lag. So it takes some time. You put the sourdough in and it takes them some time to kind of adjust to their new situation. And if you have been feeding them continuously and they've been on your counter at room temperature and you give them some new food, they may just continue in the next stage, which is growth. But if they've been sitting in the refrigerator for some time or they've been hungry for some time or something like that, they may have a longer lag. So it's important to take into consideration how long are these guys going to be in lag. So when I do sourdough, I go straight from the fridge into the sourdough and then I leave it alone for 12 hours. And that incorporates in the time for the lag. And I usually leave the end window a little flexible because I don't know how long it's going to take for them to kind of come back to life and get ready to have a feast and grow. Then the next thing that's going to happen is that they're going to move into this upward slope. That's the growth stage, and they're going to increase mass, right? So the number of microbes and the mass of microbes will increase because they're eating, dividing, making more of themselves. Those guys are eating, dividing, and making more. And it's exponential growth. It goes really fast. And then as they run out of food and the thing gets crowded, they slow down. And so that's that yellow part, right? That's their maturity. They're kind of in stationary. So they're not really growing, but they're not dying yet. They're just kind of chilling. They're hanging out. They're waiting to see what happens. Will we get more food? Will it get warm? Will it get cold? What's going on? And then eventually they'll start to go into this red phase over here when they kind of go to sleep or die. So it kind of depends on the microbes, and it depends on how long they've been unattended. They have no food or whatever. They'll just go dormant. And so there's a lot of things that will affect how fast this goes. So if you put more microbes in, they're going to double faster because if you start with 10 and double, it goes to 10, 20, 40, 80. If you start with 1, it goes to 1, 2, 4, 8, 16. So it takes longer to get a large amount. So the amount of starter that you use can have an effect. The temperature can have an effect. They grow faster when it's warm. The humidity can have effect. How long it's been dormant. So if they've been in the fridge for like 3 weeks, it is going to take them some time to get out and get going again. It's like being still for the winter and then you get out in the summer and everything's stiff. Okay, so they need some time. The best time to stop and put your bread in the oven is at the end of this growth curve or just as it hits the mature phase, because at that point they're either still growing and kicking out carbon dioxide, or they've just slowed down on growing, but they're still kind of kicking out some carbon dioxide. So you're still going to get a nice fluffy loaf, even as you're handling it and shaping it and knocking some of the air out. So that's where you really want to be for putting the bread in. If you're going to stick them in the refrigerator somewhere after they've finished their exponential growth and gone into the mature state, and then you're going to chill them, get them down cold, and they're going to slow down. Their metabolism is going to drop, and they're kind of going to go to sleep. And then you can tuck them away in the fridge, and they're good to go. So you don't need to keep them on your counter and keep making new starter every minute. So when you're looking at the growth curve, an easy way to know is to look at the volume. So part of the volume change is that they're generating carbon dioxide. So generally what I do is I put them in a jar and I put an elastic and I watch them grow. And when I can see that the space below the elastic and above the elastic is about the same, I know that they've approximately doubled, and that's a great time. I was like, okay, they've approximately doubled. That means we're good to go. We're going to go in the fridge. We're going to wait. That's also the time that if I need to make more starter and I'm waiting for my culture to be ready, when they hit doubling, I know they're ready, they're active, they're good to go, and that's when I can make bread. All right, so now's the good stuff. So when is it time to feed it? So I'm going to assume that we're starting with the culture that somebody's given you. Basically, the time to feed it, if you're on the countertop, is as it enters the plateau right after growth, right? They haven't died yet. They're just kind of going dormant. They're ready to be fed. So that's when you would feed them. If you are putting them in the fridge, if you get them to the point where they're going into the plateau, right, the flat part of the curve, then you can stick them in the fridge and they're generally pretty good to go. But basically about once a month, even if I'm making bread on a regular basis and I'm making a lot of it, it's usually not a month, but sometimes I'm traveling, I'm really busy, I'm having like depression or whatever. I just got to put them in the fridge and everything goes on hold. At least about once per month, every 3 to 4 weeks, you want to just take them out, feed them, let it sit overnight, let them double, and then you can put the new fresh ones back in the refrigerator and put them back on ice, so to speak, and they're ready to go. If you are really concerned about making sure it's active and you want your bread to proof really quickly, well, not, it's never going to be quick, but if you want your bread to proof on the quicker side, you would want to feed them once or more before you use it to make bread. But as I said, I typically go straight from the refrigerator and just allow more time for that lag phase to happen. So I have a recipe. This is what I use to make new starter. Basically, I use a scale, okay? You can't measure it with a cup measure or anything else. You have to do it by weight because sometimes there's air in there. And if there's air in the starter, you're not getting an accurate measurement. If the flour's packed, you're not getting an accurate measurement. If you go by weight, you will know that it is always what you need. So typically I use 160 grams of water, 150 grams of bread flour, and 30 grams of starter. You can tweak that a little bit one way or another if you want it to be a little bit different, but that's a pretty reliable one. But it's basically 1-to-1 flour and water, and then a portion of starter to get it going. Sometimes I just mix 1-to-1 flour and water and throw it into the old container, and I could have 30 grams, I could have 60 grams, I could have 10 grams. I just hope for the best, and then I'm watching it more closely so that I see when it's doubled. And when it's doubled, I know that it's about where I want it to be. We're good to go. So after I've mixed all those things together, I actually use a muddler, a wooden muddler, but you can use a spoon or whatever you want to mix it. So you mix it well, make sure it's all incorporated, and then I cover it with a cloth, and I will either put an elastic band around the lid, or I'll just set the lid of the jar back on, but not screw it down, leave it open. So you need to have it. It needs to have oxygen in circulating around for the sourdough to breathe. It needs oxygen. It's an aerobic process. Then I also put an elastic band on the jar so that I know when it's doubling. And it's very visual, right? I can look at it from across the room and know, okay, now's the time I got to go over there and do something with it. Or you know what? Nope, I've got 3 hours to go. It's great. And then I usually let it rest for 8 to 12 hours, and then I just kind of keep an eye on it. And then you either refrigerate it, you make bread, or you feed it again. So this is the good stuff. Here it comes. There is no right way to make a sourdough bread. I'm going to tell you how I do it. There are people all over who will tell you how they do it. So all of those methods end up making bread. Ultimately, the test of whether it's a good method is, does it make bread, and do you like the way the bread tastes? If you don't like what happened, it's time to go back to the scratch board and start again. But once you have it down, I would suggest starting with, like, take my method, take somebody else's method, pick a method, start with that, and go. Get comfortable with it. Once you're comfortable with it, you can play, right? I know what the growth curves look like. So I've a typical loaf, if I'm just throwing a loaf together and I'm doing it from memory and I want to make a big bunch of bread to, like, whatever at Christmas time, I just boop, 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 same everything. And it's 50 grams of starter, 50 grams of starter, 50 grams of starter, 50 grams of starter all the time. But I've actually tried to, there was one time when I wanted to make like 24 breads in one day. And so I got out my bowls, and I know I can put 3 in the oven at a time. And in the first bowl, I put 100 grams of starter. In the second set of bowls, I put like 80 grams of starter. In the third set of bowls, I put 60 grams of starter. In the fourth bowls, I put 40 grams of starter, all the way down until I was putting like 10 grams of starter. And that one took nearly 24 hours to proof, even in my warm kitchen. But I staged them so that they would be ready at different times. And you know what? The first time it wasn't perfect and I was doing a lot of scrambling, but after I played with it for a while, it worked, right? It worked. I got bread. Okay. So you can change how active your starter is. You can try going from the fridge. You can try feeding it and going from a fresh jar that's been sitting on your counter. You can try doing different temperatures, put it in a corner and wrap a towel around it, put it in your oven, put it on top of your refrigerator, stick it in the refrigerator and see how long it takes to proof. Maybe it's 3 days. Different amounts of starter. All of those things are things that you can play with. But as long as you vary them, and you keep an eye on it, you'll probably get there around the right time. But it's easier if you kind of have a sense what you're expecting. If you know what the dough looks like once it's ready, you're going to know, right? And you're going to be less likely to bake a dud. Um, Across the internet, there are a myriad of methods, and so far I haven't heard one that doesn't make bread. But don't panic. This is a surprise. The internet disagrees. Kind of par for the course, but just play. So there are some things you can't adjust. One is always protect your starter. So don't mess with your starter and don't use all of your starter. And if you're going to do something different with your starter, keep a backup, because once you mess up your starter and kill it, you've got to go find another starter. That may not be a big deal. Maybe it came from the neighbor next door, but if it's a starter that you ordered or a specialized starter or something, you don't want to mess with it. The things you can adjust, just about anything. So the more experience you have, the more you have freedom to play. But also, if you've got a backup starter, you can do whatever you want. If you mess it up, well, you messed it up. It's no big deal. There's no right way to play. So one of the things that I've seen with a lot of different order is, should you add flour and salt, then water, then starter? Should you let the flour and the water rest for a time before you add the starter? Should you add the starter to the flour and salt? Should you add the starter to the water? I've tried all of them. I don't really see a difference when I'm doing my method, but some people will swear by it. How much flour and salt? What's the salt ratio? I actually got a recipe. I ended up doubling the salt because my family is really a fan of salt. And when I double the salt, they like the bread better. But some people are not a fan of salt. They don't want that extra in there. The only thing you can't do is leave the salt out, because there are some biological functions that require some of that sodium from the salt to go. So you got to have some salt. So um, you got to be somewhere around the original recipe that you get from whoever you get it from. Um, you can vary the amount of starter. You can vary the amount of water. So there are high hydration breads, and they tend to be much more airy and fluffy, but they're also a lot more likely to collapse. So if you want to play around with how much water, that's great. You can add more starter, it'll go faster, add less starter. So if I'm running out of starter, I might make little tiny bits of starter in several of my breads just to stretch it out, and then I make new starter, and next time I'm back to the normal 50. You can play around with the type of flour, the mix of flour. So generally, you want to have at least some portion of the flour be a gluten flour, unless you're working with a special sourdough, because the sourdough starter eats gluten. So if you deprive it of food, it's just going to sit there and starve. So you don't want to do that. The ratio of dry ingredients to wet, so more flour, more dry. A lot of people will do a pre-proof kneading. That is something that can help the gluten align, but I have questions about whether, if the sourdough is eating the gluten and you've already aligned the gluten, are they eating the aligned gluten? I don't know. I don't see a particular difference when I've done it, but there are some people who have done it and they have very lumpy, horrid ones when they don't knead beforehand, and beautiful loaves when they do knead beforehand. So it's something to try. Another thing that I've done is, you can mix in just about anything. If you've ever eaten a bread and it's got some kinds of things in it, jalapeno cheddar or rosemary or raisins or cinnamon or whatever it is, you can add that stuff in. I've done all kinds of great ones. One of the ones my family likes is a pecan cranberry, so that's an option for you. Basically, at this point, make the bread your own, because why not, right? It's fun to play in the kitchen. But if you are not somebody who loves to play in the kitchen, it's okay. You can play it safe. You can make the same loaf of bread reliably every week for the next 50 years, and you're still going to be eating delicious bread. So there's not a right way to do it. Okay, making a sourdough. So this is the recipe that I use. And if you like this recipe, great. If you want to play around and change it, absolutely go for it. So I use 450 grams of flour, 10 grams of salt was the original recipe that I've got. Sometimes I use 15. Usually I use 15. My family's salty, so that's what I do. And then I use 333 grams of water, because For whatever reason, that's what I've settled on. And now every time it's exactly 333, but the original recipe I had was 330. And then 50 grams of starter. But as I've told you, I adjust that all the time. So the steps that I do is I add the flour and salt together and I whisk it to mix the salt in so it's well distributed. Then I add the salt and then I pour the water in on top of the flour and sourdough. And then I use my muddler to mix it until it's well incorporated. And then I go around it with a spatula and kind of roll it into a ball so it's a nice, concise ball that can proof. And when it softens and oozes out, then I know it's getting close. And once it's proofed, so you're going to set it aside, cover it with a towel or a plate or something, and put it somewhere out of the draft so it can be warm and cozy for about 8 to 12 hours. And have a look at it, see if it's ready. And then you want it to, if you shake the bowl, it's going to move back and forth a little bit like Jello. It's going to have some give to it. So the proofing, basically, sourdough needs to have those air pockets and be tangy and delicious. So you don't want it to overproof. So if you look in it, it's kind of turned to goo. It will very possibly, it doesn't have enough structure to hold it together. So it may just completely collapse. So you kind of want to watch for overproofing as much as underproofing. If it's underproofed, it'll be flat and dead. If it's overproofed, it'll... When you're shaping it, and I have a video that I put on YouTube that does shaping, basically what I do, I've seen a couple people knead it and beat it and smush it and whatever else, roughhouse the dough just before putting it in the oven, and I don't get it because when you're doing all of that punching down, you're essentially knocking all the air out of it, and that's what makes bread lovely and fluffy. So do this gently. So basically, I take a spatula and kind of scoop it gently onto the tray or onto a floured surface, and then I kind of pull the four corners up to make a ball, turn it gently over, and then I kind of turn it in circles, smoothing the edges until I have a nice tidy ball and it looks really smooth around the top. At that point, it's kind of an art. There's a lot of different, the internet disagrees on this too. There's a lot of different methods for shaping, but once you do it, basically try things, see what you like. But that's, I just kind of use a movement like this to kind of smooth out the edges and twist it a little bit so that I'm kind of tucking it under as I go. And then once it's shaped, you lift it, kind of brush any heavy flour off, but it should have flour on the top, and set it into a prepared pan with the seam down, okay? So you don't want it to start unraveling from the top. And generally at that point, I'll turn the oven on. So I start the oven preheating after I've put the dough in the pan, because that gives me an automatic like 20, 25-minute waiting period while I am going to be just letting that get just a little bit more air, kind of settle in, get its bubbles back. So it just gives me a little extra proofing after I've handled it. And then I put it in, I preheat my oven to 500 degrees Celsius or 500 degrees Fahrenheit. I don't know why I wrote Celsius. It's probably because I think in Celsius when I'm doing science stuff, but if you put it at 500 degrees Celsius, it's going to be a very hot oven. So you want Fahrenheit, or you can transfer that into Celsius, and then bake it for 30 to 35 minutes. For some reason, my water is 333 and my time is 33. So there's something with threes going on for me. That may not work for you. And then here's what I do with the pan. So there's a couple ways you can do it. It needs to be on a surface that breathes so the air can circulate all around it. But if it's sitting on a hot surface by the time the rest of it bakes, the bottom may be a little charred. And I don't particularly like that. So basically I have a pot or a Dutch oven or something like that, and I get a cooling rack that's the same diameter as the pot and put it in there. And then I put in a silpat. You can also use parchment paper. And I set the dough on the silpat. So then the air can circulate around it, but it doesn't go leaking through the cooling rack. You could also use 2 layers of parchment paper. So put parchment paper, put like a little sprinkle of flour to create some space, and then put it on top, though you'll get a darker bottom. And while I'm talking about parchment paper, it is not wax paper. If you use wax paper, the wax will melt onto your bread and make a big mess of your pot. just don't do it. I've also seen other people do things like set it on seeds or so like sesame seeds or something like that to add flavor and lift it up off the bottom of the oven just a little bit. That's another great option. It's really what works for you. And part of the reason that that works to create circulating air is that warm air rises, cool air sinks, and that means that the air inside of the pot is going to circulate and it's going to cook it best. Okay, so um, it's just generally a great food. We've talked about a lot of, or I've talked about a lot of this stuff already. It's got a low glycemic index, so it can be a great food for diabetics that are looking for a diet-friendly bread. Again, anytime you eat anything that's adding to the sugar in your body. So just because it's has a lower glycemic index doesn't mean you can eat half the loaf. Um, it also seems like the lactic acid in the bread is at least part of the effect. So if you have a bread that has a higher amount of the lactic and acetic acid, that seems to be part of what's moderating the effect. Because the bread ferments for a long time, the gluten is partially broken down by the starter. So people find that easier to digest and easier on their digestive system. And it has nutritional benefits. It has a higher degree of mineral absorption than most breads. It provides folate, and it has an increased level of antioxidants. So there's a lot of sort of acidic compounds that are in there that are the healthy acids that I'm kind of losing my mind right now. It also has a lot of prebiotics in there that kind of help your body, and those can contribute to improved gut health. Once you put it in the oven, all of the microbes that are in it, they're goners. They don't survive. So they're not actually adding any microbes to your diet, but it does have a lot of things that can help feed the microbes in your gut and the good ones. So that's a great thing to do. So the last thing, the hard part, storing the sourdough. If you don't think that you're going to eat it all in one sitting, wait until it cools to slice it. So what happens if you slice it when it's hot, a lot of the moisture will leave the bread and it'll dry out quicker. Once you do cut the bread, store it with the cut side facing down onto the plate to prevent it from drying. You can store it inside of a bread box or some other kind of breathable container. What I do is actually wrap it in a kitchen towel and set it on my counter, cut side down. And that towel allows it to breathe enough that it's not getting all extra moist inside and getting moldy, but it's also not drying out too much. It kind of is protective without being completely unbreathable. The lactic acid bacteria and other physical and chemical changes in the bread help protect it against premature firming and drying. But if you find out that it tastes a little stale, that can actually be a result of crystallization of the molecules within the bread. So if you take it and you reheat it, you toast it or whatever, that can actually reduce the staling and improve the flavor overall. However, if you have stale sourdough, the best thing to do with it is to make croutons. So I have a lot of references. I'd be happy to send all of you these, but it would be a lot to put in there. So if you have any questions about sourdough, feel free to ask.